The trowel made contact with something solid beneath the Turkish soil, and in that singular moment, a moment that would ripple backward through 6,000 years of forgotten history, and forward through every archaeology textbook that would need to be rewritten, Dr. Klaus Schmidt felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, in a way that had nothing to do with the blistering Anatolian sun beating down on the dig site known as Göbekli Tepe, a name that translates prosaically to Potbelly Hill and gives absolutely no indication of the world-shattering secret it had been keeping since before the pyramids were even a glimmer in some pharaoh's ambitious imagination. The sound was wrong, somehow fundamentally different from the countless other times his tool had struck rock or root or the endless variations of compacted earth that make up an archaeologist's daily existence. And as he carefully brushed away the centuries of accumulated dirt with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling newborn babies or defusing unexploded ordnance, what emerged from the ground was a carved limestone pillar standing roughly 18 feet tall, weighing somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 tons, and covered in bas-relief sculptures of animals so precisely rendered that you could count the feathers on the vultures and see the individual muscles rippling beneath the skin of the predatory cats that seemed to prowl across the stone's surface with an eerie sense of motion, as if they might leap from the rock at any moment and resume whatever eternal hunt these ancient artists had captured in mineral permanence. But here was the problem, the fundamental impossibility that would send shockwaves through the academic establishment and cause more than one tenured professor to suffer what could only be described as an existential crisis. According to every timeline, every carefully constructed narrative of human development that had been taught in universities and museums, documentary films for the better part of a century, the people who carved these pillars and arranged them in precise circles aligned with celestial bodies, and transported multi-ton blocks of stone across distances that would challenge modern construction crews with all their hydraulic lifts and diesel-powered machinery. These people were not supposed to exist. Or rather, they were supposed to exist, but only as small bands of hunter-gatherers who spent their days tracking antelope across the plains and their nights huddled around fires, telling stories and making simple tools from flint and bone, living a hand-to-mouth existence that left no time or energy for the kind of monumental architecture that requires not just physical labor, but abstract planning, mathematical precision, artistic vision, and the kind of complex social organization that can convince or compel hundreds of workers to dedicate years of their lives to a construction project whose purpose remains maddeningly unclear, even to the modern researchers who have spent decades trying to decipher its meaning. The carbon dating came back, and then came back again, after the first results were questioned and re-questioned, because surely there had been some contamination, some mistake in the laboratory procedures, some cosmic joke being played on the scientific community. But the numbers refused to budge from their impossible truth. 9,600 BCE, give or take a few centuries, which placed these structures at approximately 11,600 years old, making them not just older than the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, or any of the other candidates that usually appear on lists of humanity's oldest architectural achievements, but older than agriculture itself, older than pottery, older than the entire concept of civilization as it had been understood and taught and accepted as fundamental truth by everyone from elementary school teachers to doctoral candidates defending their dissertations on the origins of human social complexity. It was as if someone had discovered a fully functional smartphone buried beneath the ruins of ancient Rome, or found a Boeing 747 painted on the walls of a Paleolithic cave, or uncovered evidence that Shakespeare had written his plays using a laptop. The kind of temporal impossibility that breaks not just one assumption, but an entire cascading chain of assumptions that had been built one upon another like a house of cards that someone had just introduced to a Category 5 hurricane. Standing at Göbekli Tepe today, with the excavated pillars rising from their circles like stone sentinels guarding secrets they will never fully reveal, you can feel the weight of those shattered assumptions pressing down on you with almost physical force. And you begin to understand that this is not merely an archaeological site, but a crime scene, where the victim is our entire understanding of how civilization began. And the evidence suggests that the murder weapon was nothing less than our own arrogance, our unshakable conviction that we, moderns, represent the pinnacle of human achievement, and that everyone who came before us was necessarily less capable, less intelligent, less sophisticated than we are, with our computers and our skyscrapers and our ability to order dinner from our phones, while simultaneously streaming entertainment and monitoring our heart rates through devices strapped to our wrists. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe stand as silent testimony to a different truth, one that is simultaneously humbling and awe-inspiring. That human brilliance is not a recent invention, that our ancestors were not simply primitive versions of ourselves waiting for the inevitable march of progress to transform them into something approaching our own magnificence, but rather that they were fully realized human beings with the same capacity for abstract thought, artistic expression, spiritual yearning, and technological innovation that we possess. And that they applied these capabilities to creating something so magnificent that it still stands 11,600 years later, which is considerably longer than most of our modern buildings will last, given that we consider a structure from the 1950s to be practically ancient and worthy of either preservation as a historical artifact or demolition, to make way for something more aligned with contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. The comparisons to modern construction only make the achievement more staggering rather than less, because when engineers and architects and construction managers examine these sites with their contemporary expertise and their understanding of logistics and labor management and the physics of moving massive stones across uneven terrain, they find themselves confronted with problems that have no obvious solutions. Or rather, they have solutions, but those solutions require levels of organization and technical capability that supposedly did not exist in 9600 BCE, which creates a paradox that can only be resolved by accepting that our timeline is wrong, our assumptions are wrong, and our entire narrative of human development needs to be fundamentally reconsidered from the ground up. Imagine trying to organize a construction project today that requires moving stones weighing as much as a fully loaded cement truck without the benefit of wheels, which had not been invented yet, or metal tools, which would not appear for thousands of years, or draft animals like oxen or horses, which had not been domesticated and would not be available for heavy labor for millennia to come. And then imagine doing this not with a crew of dozens, but with hundreds of workers who need to be fed and housed and coordinated and motivated to work together toward a common goal, which implies the existence of some form of authority structure and resource management, and probably a pretty compelling reason for why everyone should dedicate enormous amounts of time and energy to this project, instead of just focusing on the day-to-day business of finding food and avoiding predators and making sure the tribe survives another season. The art carved into these pillars tells us something profound about the minds that conceived and executed this vision. Because these are not crude stick figures or simple geometric patterns, but sophisticated representations of the natural world, rendered with an attention to anatomical detail and compositional balance that would be impressive in any era. And the fact that they were created by people who had supposedly never seen a city, or read a book, or been exposed to any of the cultural influences that we typically associate with artistic development, makes their achievement all the more remarkable. Like discovering that a child who grew up alone in the wilderness had somehow taught himself to play Beethoven on a piano he built from scratch using only materials he found in the forest. The animals depicted on the pillars, lions, foxes, gazelles, vultures, scorpions, snakes, parade across the stone surface in what appears to be some kind of narrative or symbolic system that communicated meaning to the people who built this place, meaning that is frustratingly opaque to us, despite our advanced degrees and our sophisticated analytical tools, and our ability to decode ancient languages and decipher astronomical alignments. Because there is no Rosetta Stone for Göbekli Tepe. No helpful bilingual inscription that can serve as a key to unlock the symbolic language these ancient artists were speaking in stone. Which means we can appreciate the technical skill and artistic vision without fully understanding what they were trying to say. Like listening to a song in a language you don't speak and being moved by the melody and the emotion in the singer's voice, while remaining ignorant of the actual words and their specific meanings. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not what the ancient builders created, but what they did with it when they were finished. Because the archaeological evidence suggests that after spending decades, or perhaps even centuries, constructing these massive stone circles and carving them with intricate designs and using them for whatever ceremonial or spiritual or social purposes they served, the people who built them made the deliberate decision to bury the entire complex, filling in the spaces between the pillars with thousands of tons of earth and rocks, carefully interring their greatest achievement like a pharaoh being laid to rest in a tomb. And then they walked away and never came back, leaving the site to be slowly covered by wind-blown soil and the accumulated debris of passing millennia, until it became just another hill in the Turkish landscape, unremarkable and forgotten, until Klaus Schmidt's trowel struck stone and began the process of resurrection. The implications of this deliberate burial are staggering, because it means that whatever purpose Göbekli Tepe served, whatever role it played in the spiritual or social or political life of the community that built it, that purpose was either fulfilled or abandoned or transformed in some fundamental way that required not just walking away from the site, but actively ensuring that it would be preserved beneath the earth, protected from the elements and from whatever changes were coming to the world above. And we might ask ourselves, what would drive us to make a similar decision today? What circumstances would lead us to deliberately bury St. Peter's Basilica, or the Taj Mahal, or the Sydney Opera House, covering our greatest architectural achievements with dirt, and walking away to start over somewhere else with some new vision of what the sacred, or the significant, or the simply necessary looks like? This was not supposed to be possible, and the fact that it is possible, that it demonstrably happened and left physical evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away or conveniently forgotten, means that every neat timeline showing civilization beginning in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, with the invention of writing and the formation of the first cities, is not wrong exactly, but rather incomplete in a way that fundamentally changes the story we have been telling ourselves about who we are and where we came from and how we got to be the people we are today. Sitting in climate-controlled environments, staring at glowing screens, while our ancient ancestors' stone monuments continue their patient vigil under the Turkish sun, waiting to reveal more secrets about the civilizations that rose and fell and rose again, long before we thought human beings were capable of such things. The discovery at Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly, but a revelation. Not an exception that proves the rule, but evidence that the rule itself needs to be rewritten. And as more sites are discovered, and more dates are pushed back, and more assumptions are overturned, we are being forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that human history is far longer, far stranger, and far more complex than we ever imagined, and that the story of civilization is not a simple, linear progression from primitive to advanced, but rather a tangled web of rises and falls, achievements and catastrophes, moments of transcendent brilliance, separated by dark ages when knowledge was lost and had to be painstakingly recovered or reinvented, by people who had no idea that their ancestors had already solved these problems thousands of years before. And if one civilization could rise to such heights 11,600 years ago, and then vanish so completely that we forgot it ever existed, buried beneath the accumulating sediment of passing centuries, until an archaeologist's tool happened to strike stone at just the right angle to begin the process of remembrance, then we must ask ourselves, what other civilizations might be waiting beneath our feet? What other chapters of human history have been lost to time and circumstance, and the simple fact that most of what human beings create eventually returns to dust? And whether the story we are currently living, with our technologies and our certainties and our conviction that we represent the apex of human development, might someday be just another forgotten layer waiting for some future archaeologist to uncover and puzzle over and try to understand. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Who were these people who built Göbekli Tepe? What kind of society could organize such an undertaking? And what happened to them after they buried their greatest achievement and walked away into the mists of prehistory, leaving behind only questions carved in stone and the unsettling suggestion that everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization might need to be reconsidered from the very beginning? The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not abstractions or theoretical constructs, existing only in the footnotes of academic papers and the carefully hedged language of archaeological reports. But rather, they were human beings who woke up each morning to the challenges and opportunities of their particular moment in history, who felt the sun on their faces and the wind in their hair, who experienced love and loss and fear and triumph, who told jokes and nursed grudges, and sang songs and taught their children the skills they would need to survive in a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more intimate than anything we can truly comprehend from our vantage point of climate-controlled comfort and instant global communication. The archaeological evidence allows us to reconstruct fragments of their daily existence with surprising clarity, painting a picture of a society far more sophisticated than the term hunter-gatherer typically suggests. Because these were people who understood the seasonal migrations of game animals with such precision that they could predict where specific herds would be at specific times of the year, who possessed encyclopedic knowledge of which plants were edible and which were medicinal, and which would kill you if you made the mistake of eating them, who could read weather patterns in the behavior of birds and insects, who knew the stars so intimately that they could navigate by them and mark the passage of time through their movements across the night sky, and who possessed the kind of practical intelligence that allowed them to thrive in an environment that would kill most modern humans within a matter of days if we were dropped into it without our technological support systems and our accumulated consumer goods. Their daily lives would have been structured around the rhythms of nature in ways that we can barely imagine, given that most of us experience the changing seasons primarily through adjustments to our heating and cooling systems, and perhaps some variation in the produce available at the supermarket. But for the builders of Göbekli Tepe, survival depended on an intimate understanding of the natural world and their place within it, which meant knowing when certain plants would produce seeds or roots that could be harvested and stored, when particular animals would be fat and slow from their own seasonal feeding patterns, when water sources would be most reliable, and when weather conditions would make travel dangerous or impossible. All of which required not just individual knowledge, but collective memory, passed down through generations and refined through centuries of trial and error, and the kind of observational skills that we have largely lost in our rush to replace direct experience of the world with mediated representations filtered through screens and sensors. The evidence from the site suggests that these people had developed sophisticated food storage techniques, which implies planning for the future and the ability to delay gratification in ways that require abstract thinking and temporal reasoning. And they had almost certainly developed methods of preserving meat and processing plant materials to extend their nutritional value beyond the immediate harvest, which means they possessed a form of technology that was perhaps less visually impressive than our own, but no less effective at solving the fundamental problem of how to keep yourself and your community alive through the lean times when food was scarce and the landscape offered little sustenance to those who did not know its secrets. But here is where the story becomes truly extraordinary, moving beyond the realm of mere survival into something approaching what we might recognize as culture or civilization, or, at the very least, a level of social organization that transcends the basic requirements of feeding yourself and avoiding predators. These people, who, according to traditional timelines, should have been living in small, mobile bands of perhaps 20 to 30 individuals, somehow managed to coordinate the labor of hundreds of workers to move stones weighing between 10 and 20 tons which is to say, stones that weigh roughly the same as 3 or 4 full-grown African elephants, or 2.5 luxury SUVs, or approximately the same as a small spacecraft, across distances that may have been several kilometers. Then, shape these massive blocks using only stone tools that were themselves laboriously created through a process called knapping, that involves striking one stone against another with precisely the right angle and force to create sharp edges and useful forms. And finally, erect these pillars in carefully planned circular arrangements that show evidence of astronomical alignment and geometric precision that would impress modern surveyors with their laser measuring devices and GPS coordinates. The engineering challenges alone would be formidable even with modern equipment, which is why contemporary contractors and project managers who specialize in moving heavy equipment and coordinating complex construction projects often express genuine bewilderment when confronted with the realities of what was accomplished at Göbekli Tepe, because the logistics of moving even one of these pillars without wheels or metal tools or draft animals or any of the technological advantages we take for granted would require levels of planning and problem-solving and sheer human effort that seem almost impossible. And yet, the archaeological evidence is undeniable. They did it, not once, but dozens of times, creating multiple circular structures that required moving and erecting hundreds of tons of stone across a construction project that likely spanned multiple generations and required sustained commitment from a community that had to continue feeding itself and maintaining its social cohesion, while simultaneously dedicating enormous resources to a building project whose purpose remains frustratingly obscure. The organizational implications of this achievement cannot be overstated, because moving stones of this size is not something you can accomplish with casual cooperation or spontaneous collaboration, but rather requires the kind of hierarchical social structure that we typically associate with civilizations that have writing and kings and tax collectors and all the other trappings of what historians conventionally define as complex societies. Which means that somewhere in this supposedly primitive community, there had to be individuals or groups with sufficient authority to plan the project, allocate resources, organize labor, resolve disputes, and maintain morale across the years or decades it would take to complete even a single stone circle. And this, in turn, implies the existence of social differentiation, specialized roles, probably some form of religious or political leadership, and quite possibly a stratified society with different classes or castes, or at minimum, a recognition that some people's time and skills were more valuable than others in the context of this particular undertaking. To put this in contemporary terms, imagine trying to organize 100 people to help you move to a new apartment. Except, instead of moving for a day, you are asking them to commit to a construction project that will take years to complete and offers no obvious practical benefit like shelter or food storage or defensive walls to protect against enemies. And instead of offering payment, you are relying on some combination of social obligation, religious fervor, political coercion, or collective belief in the importance of the project. And you begin to appreciate the magnitude of what these ancient organizers accomplished, which makes the challenge of managing a modern corporation or coordinating a government bureaucracy seem almost trivial by comparison, at least in terms of the fundamental difficulty of getting people to work together toward a common goal, when the benefits are abstract and the labor is backbreaking, and there are no employee handbooks or management consultants or team-building retreats to help maintain organizational cohesion. The art carved into the pillars provides our most direct connection to the minds and worldviews of these ancient builders, offering glimpses into their concerns and their cosmology, and their understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural world that sustained them, and occasionally threatened them. And the level of artistic sophistication on display is genuinely remarkable, featuring animals rendered with such attention to anatomical detail that modern zoologists can identify not just the species, but in some cases the specific poses and behaviors being depicted, suggesting that the artists who created these carvings had observed their subjects with the kind of careful attention that we might associate with natural history illustrators or wildlife documentarians. Except that these ancient artists were working without the benefit of reference photographs or field guides, or any of the other tools we use to aid memory and ensure accuracy. The animals parade across the stone surfaces in what appears to be a carefully orchestrated arrangement that probably conveyed specific meanings or told particular stories or represented cosmological principles that were obvious to the people who created and used this space, but remain tantalizingly unclear to modern researchers, despite decades of study and analysis and theorizing. Creating a situation where we can appreciate the technical virtuosity and artistic vision while remaining fundamentally ignorant of the content. Like admiring the brushwork and composition of a painting without understanding the mythology or history or allegory it depicts. Or like hearing a symphony and being moved by its emotional power while remaining unaware of the program or narrative structure that gives it meaning beyond pure sound. The symbolic system encoded in these carvings represents a form of communication that predates writing by thousands of years, but was no less sophisticated in its ability to convey complex ideas and preserve cultural knowledge across generations. Because these images were not random decorations or idle doodling, but rather constituted a visual language that could be read and interpreted by members of the community who had been initiated into its meanings. Which means that somewhere in this society, there existed teachers who could explain the significance of particular animals or arrangements or symbolic relationships, and students who learned to decode these meanings and carry them forward into the next generation, creating an unbroken chain of transmission that may have lasted for centuries before the site was finally buried and the knowledge lost, surviving only in the physical evidence that continues to baffle and intrigue researchers who bring all the tools of modern archaeology and comparative mythology and cognitive science to bear on the problem of understanding what these ancient artists were, trying to communicate to each other and to whatever gods or spirits or cosmic forces they believed were listening. We might compare this to discovering a beautifully illuminated medieval manuscript written in a language for which no translation exists and no related languages survive, where we can admire the craftsmanship and artistry of the illustrations while remaining forever locked out of the actual meaning of the text. Or like finding sheet music for a composition by an unknown composer writing in a notation system that has been forgotten, where we can see that something significant was being communicated but lack the key to unlock its meaning. Which is perhaps one of the most frustrating aspects of studying prehistoric cultures, the knowledge that these were fully realized human beings with rich inner lives and complex belief systems, and profound insights into the nature of existence. And yet we are separated from their understanding by an unbridgeable gulf of time and cultural context that no amount of scientific analysis can fully overcome. And then, after all this effort, after generations of labor and countless hours of skilled carving, and the dedication of resources that could have been used for any number of practical purposes that would have more obviously contributed to the community's survival and prosperity, the people who built Göbekli Tepe made the extraordinary decision to bury it, to deliberately cover these massive structures with thousands of tons of earth and rubble, in what appears to have been a careful and systematic process rather than the gradual accumulation of debris that characterizes most abandoned sites. Which means that this was not a case of a civilization collapsing and leaving ruins behind for archaeologists to discover, but rather a conscious choice to preserve and protect and perhaps consecrate these structures by returning them to the earth from which they had been extracted. And we are left to wonder, what could possibly motivate such a decision? What changes in belief or circumstance or social organization would lead a community to abandon the single most significant achievement of their entire cultural tradition, a monument that had probably served as the center of their spiritual and social life for generations, and represented an investment of labor and resources that would be difficult to calculate even with modern accounting methods. The parallels to our own time are both obvious and unsettling, because we live in an age when climate change and resource depletion and social instability are forcing us to contemplate the possibility that we too might need to abandon our most significant achievements, whether that means coastal cities that will be inundated by rising seas, or agricultural regions that will become uninhabitable due to persistent drought, or entire ways of life that will no longer be sustainable in a world transformed by the cumulative effects of our industrial civilization. And while we have not yet reached the point of deliberately burying our skyscrapers and shopping malls and sports stadiums, we are increasingly aware that the permanence we once assumed for our built environment was always illusory, and that everything we have created could be swept away by forces beyond our control or consequences of our own actions, leaving only scattered remnants for future archaeologists to puzzle over and try to understand. The question of what happened to these people after they buried their greatest achievement and walked away remains one of the most compelling mysteries in archaeology, because they did not simply vanish into the mists of prehistory, but rather must have continued living somewhere, must have carried forward at least some of their knowledge and traditions and cultural practices into whatever came next. But the archaeological record becomes frustratingly unclear at precisely the point where we most want answers, leaving us to speculate about whether they dispersed into smaller groups that were absorbed into other populations, whether they migrated to new territories where their descendants built different kinds of settlements that have yet to be discovered, whether they experienced some kind of catastrophic event, environmental, social, or spiritual, that shattered their cohesion as a community, or whether they simply evolved into something different, transforming their culture and their practices in ways that would make them unrecognizable to their ancestors who had carved those pillars and arranged them in perfect circles aligned with the stars. What we know with certainty is that the story does not end with Göbekli Tepe, but rather continues through the long arc of human history that eventually leads to the first cities and the invention of writing, and all the other milestones that we conventionally associate with the beginning of civilization. Which means that these ancient builders were not a dead end or an isolated experiment, but rather part of a longer narrative that connects them to us across the millennia, making them not just objects of archaeological curiosity, but rather our ancestors in the broadest sense. People whose innovations and achievements, and perhaps also their failures and abandonments, contributed to the slow accumulation of knowledge and capability that eventually produced the world we inhabit today, with all its wonders and terrors and profound uncertainties about what comes next. Which brings us, inevitably, to the realization that Göbekli Tepe is not alone, that similar discoveries are emerging from other parts of the world, each one pushing back the timeline of human achievement and complicating our understanding of how civilization began, suggesting that what happened in Turkey 11,600 years ago was not unique, but rather part of a broader pattern of human brilliance erupting across the ancient world, in multiple places and multiple times. A pattern that challenges everything we thought we knew about our own origins and demands that we confront the uncomfortable possibility that the story we have been telling ourselves about human progress is not wrong exactly, but rather incomplete in ways that fundamentally change its meaning. And if we want to understand the full scope of this revelation, we need to zoom out from this single site and examine the global picture, looking at all the other places where similar evidence is emerging of sophisticated societies existing thousands of years before they were supposed to be possible. Because the implications extend far beyond one mysterious temple complex in Turkey and touch on the most fundamental questions we can ask about ourselves. Who are we? Where did we come from? And what does it mean that our ancestors were capable of such achievements at a time when we thought they should have been living in caves and struggling merely to survive? The discovery at Göbekli Tepe would be remarkable enough if it stood alone as a singular anomaly in the archaeological record, some kind of inexplicable lightning strike of human achievement that defied explanation and remained forever isolated in time and space. But the reality that has been slowly emerging over the past few decades as new sites are excavated and old assumptions are challenged, and technologies like ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery reveal hidden structures that had been invisible to previous generations of researchers, is far more profound and far more unsettling to our conventional understanding of human history. Because Göbekli Tepe is not alone, not even close to alone, but rather represents just one node in a global network of ancient sites that all share certain characteristics: monumental architecture, sophisticated artistic expression, complex social organization, and dates that push back the timeline of civilization far beyond what traditional narratives would allow. And when you start mapping these sites and comparing their features, and considering their implications collectively rather than individually, a pattern emerges that suggests something fundamental about human beings and our relationship to civilization. Something that challenges the neat, linear story we have been teaching in schools and museums about how culture developed first in one place and then spread outward like ripples in a pond, carrying the benefits of agriculture and urban living and written language to the supposedly primitive peoples who had been waiting in darkness for the light of civilization to reach them and transform their existence. Consider Jericho, that ancient city in the Jordan Valley that has been continuously inhabited for approximately 11,000 years, making it one of the oldest settlements in the world and a place where the archaeological layers stack up like pages in a book, documenting the entire span of human civilization, from the Neolithic period to the present day, and where excavations have revealed massive stone walls and a tower that dates to around 8000 BCE, constructed by people who were supposedly still figuring out the basics of agriculture and sedentary living, but who somehow found the time and resources and organizational capacity to build defensive structures that would not look out of place in a medieval fortress. Which raises the obvious question of what they were defending against, and what kind of society could mobilize the labor and maintain the social cohesion necessary to complete such a project, when, according to traditional timelines, they should have been small groups of proto-farmers just beginning to experiment with planting seeds and living in one place, instead of following the seasonal migrations of game animals. The tower at Jericho stands approximately 8 meters tall and contains an internal staircase of 22 stone steps, which means that whoever designed and built this structure understood principles of load-bearing architecture and had developed techniques for shaping and stacking stone with precision. And the fact that this tower predates the pyramids of Egypt by approximately 4,000 years should give us pause and make us reconsider our assumptions about the capabilities of Neolithic peoples. Because this is not crude piling of rocks, but rather sophisticated construction that required planning and engineering knowledge, and probably a good deal of trial and error to get right. Suggesting that by 8000 BCE, there were already communities in the Levant that had moved far beyond subsistence-level existence and were engaging in the kind of ambitious building projects that we typically associate with much later periods of human history. Moving eastward across the ancient world, we find Mehrgarh in what is now Pakistan, a site that dates to approximately 7000 BCE and shows evidence of sophisticated agricultural practices, including the cultivation of barley and wheat and the domestication of cattle, along with elaborate burial practices that involved placing valuable goods with the dead, suggesting belief in an afterlife and the existence of social hierarchies where some individuals merited more elaborate treatment in death than others, and the presence of what appears to be organized craft production, with specialized areas for pottery making and bead making and metallurgy, that implies a level of economic complexity and division of labor that should not have existed according to conventional timelines that place such developments thousands of years later in Mesopotamia. The people of Mehrgarh were not simply growing food and building shelters, but rather engaging in long-distance trade networks, as evidenced by the presence of materials like turquoise and lapis lazuli that had to have been imported from distant sources, which means they had established relationships with other communities, had developed systems for transporting goods across challenging terrain, and presumably had some form of exchange economy that allowed them to acquire luxury items in return for whatever goods or services they could provide. And all of this was happening in the 7th millennium BCE, when, according to traditional narratives, human beings were still in the very early stages of figuring out how to live in settled communities, and had not yet developed the complex economic and social structures that we associate with true civilization. Farther east still, in what is now Thailand, the archaeological site of Ban Chang has yielded evidence of bronze metallurgy dating to approximately 2000 BCE, which would place the development of this technology in Southeast Asia at roughly the same time it was emerging in the ancient Near East, completely independent of any influence or contact between these regions, which suggests that human communities separated by thousands of miles and completely different environmental conditions, and presumably no direct communication or cultural exchange, were nevertheless arriving at similar technological solutions to similar problems, much the way evolution repeatedly produces similar adaptations in response to similar selective pressures, creating eyes in organisms as different as octopi and eagles and humans, or wings in creatures as diverse as bats and birds and insects. Because the underlying principles of physics and chemistry and the fundamental nature of the materials available to work with impose certain constraints and suggest certain possibilities that any sufficiently creative and experimentally minded culture will eventually discover through the combination of observation, imagination, and systematic trial and error that we recognize as the foundation of technological innovation. The bronze artifacts from Banqiang are not crude first attempts at metalworking, but rather sophisticated pieces showing advanced techniques of alloying and casting, which implies that by the time these objects were made, the people who created them had already been working with metal for a considerable period, refining their methods and developing expertise through generations of accumulated knowledge, which pushes the origins of metallurgy in Southeast Asia back even further into the murky realm of prehistory, where the archaeological record becomes increasingly fragmentary, and our ability to make definitive statements about what was happening when becomes increasingly compromised by the simple fact that most of what human beings create eventually decays and disappears, leaving only the most durable materials and the most fortunate preservation conditions to tell us anything at all about the lives and achievements of our distant ancestors. The global pattern becomes even more striking when we consider the evidence emerging from the Americas, where sites like Corral in Peru date to approximately 2600 BCE and show evidence of monumental architecture, complex social organization, and long-distance trade networks developing completely independently of the civilizations in the Old World. Because the Americas were populated by people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the last Ice Age, and then had no contact with Africa, Europe, or Asia for thousands of years. Which means that whatever they achieved was accomplished without any influence from the supposedly more advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt or the Indus Valley. And yet, they still built pyramids and organized cities and developed sophisticated agricultural systems and created art and architecture that rivals anything being produced in the Old World during the same period, which strongly suggests that the capacity for civilization is not something that was invented once in one place and then spread to other peoples who learned it from their more advanced neighbors, but rather is something fundamental to human nature, a set of potentials that will inevitably express themselves whenever and wherever conditions allow, regardless of whether there is any contact with other civilizations or any opportunity to learn from their examples. The pyramids of Corral are not miniature versions of Egyptian pyramids or crude attempts to copy something seen elsewhere, but rather original creations that emerged from the specific cultural and religious contexts of Andean civilization, suggesting that the impulse to build monumental structures and organize complex societies and create symbolic systems that encode cultural knowledge and spiritual beliefs is something that arises independently in human communities across the world, as naturally and inevitably as language itself develops in every human culture, regardless of isolation or contact with other linguistic communities. Perhaps even more provocative and controversial is the growing body of evidence suggesting that ancient peoples were capable of oceanic navigation and long-distance seafaring, far earlier than traditional timelines would allow. Because if we accept the conventional narrative, boats capable of crossing significant bodies of water were not developed until relatively recently in human history. Yet there is mounting evidence of trade goods and cultural influences showing up in places they should not be if ancient peoples were confined to coastal navigation and short island-hopping voyages. And while the evidence remains hotly debated and often falls short of the kind of definitive proof that would satisfy skeptical archaeologists who have spent their careers defending the traditional chronology, there are enough anomalies and suggestive finds to at least raise the possibility that our ancestors were more adventurous and more capable mariners than we have given them credit for, which would significantly expand the possibilities for cultural contact and knowledge exchange between distant regions, and might help explain some of the striking similarities that appear in widely separated cultures. Similarities that could be the result of either independent invention or ancient contact that has left no clear archaeological signature beyond the cultural parallels themselves. The problem with maritime archaeology is that sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower during the last ice age than they are today, which means that vast stretches of coastline that were inhabited during the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods are now underwater, along with whatever settlements and harbours and evidence of seafaring capabilities those ancient peoples might have developed, creating a massive blind spot in our understanding of human history, because we are essentially looking for evidence of coastal civilizations in places where there is no longer any coast to examine. And any cities or towns or trading posts that might have existed on those now submerged shorelines have been scoured away by millennia of wave action and tidal forces and the simple, destructive power of salt water acting on organic materials and even on stone structures that were not specifically designed to withstand permanent submersion. The realization that we may have lost entire civilizations to rising sea levels is simultaneously humbling and terrifying, because it reminds us that the geography we consider permanent and unchanging is actually quite dynamic on geological timescales, and what seems like solid ground today could be ocean floor tomorrow, or at least tomorrow in the long view of deep time, which makes our current situation with anthropogenic climate change and projected sea level rise feel less like an unprecedented crisis and more like a recurring pattern in the long story of human civilization's contentious relationship with the natural world that sustains it, and occasionally threatens to overwhelm it. We think of ourselves as permanent fixtures on the landscape, building our cities and our monuments and our critical infrastructure with the assumption that the geography will remain stable and predictable for centuries or millennia to come. But the archaeological record tells a different story, one in which coastlines advance and retreat, rivers change their courses, fertile regions become deserts, and deserts bloom into gardens, and human communities that seemed permanent and powerful are swept away by forces they could not control or even fully understand, leaving only scattered remnants for later archaeologists to discover and puzzle over, and try to incorporate into a coherent narrative of human development that makes sense of the fragments, while acknowledging how much has been irretrievably lost. The blindness we exhibit toward these patterns is itself worth examining, because we tend to assume that our current technological sophistication and our scientific understanding of natural processes will somehow protect us from the kinds of catastrophic disruptions that affected earlier civilizations, as if knowledge itself were a talisman against disaster. But the people who built Göbekli Tepe and Jericho and Mehrgar and all the other sites we have been discussing were not stupid or ignorant, but rather possessed sophisticated understanding of their environments and had developed technologies and social structures that worked effectively for centuries or even millennia. And yet, they still experienced catastrophic disruptions that either destroyed their civilizations entirely or forced them to abandon their greatest achievements and start over in new locations with diminished resources and fragmented knowledge. Which suggests that civilizational collapse is not a bug that can be fixed through better planning or more advanced technology, but rather a feature of complex societies that inevitably reach points where their demands on the environment exceed sustainable levels, or where internal contradictions and external pressures combine to create instability that cannot be managed or contained, regardless of how sophisticated the culture might be in other respects. We like to think that we are different, that our computers and our scientific method and our global communication networks will allow us to anticipate and respond to crises in ways that earlier civilizations could not. But this may be just another form of the hubris that has afflicted every civilization throughout history. The conviction that we are special, and that the patterns that applied to our predecessors somehow do not apply to us because we are smarter or more technologically advanced, or simply blessed by fate or providence with a unique position in the grand arc of human history. The other striking feature of this global pattern of early civilization is how little we knew about it until very recently, which raises the question of what else we might be missing. What other sites remain undiscovered beneath jungle canopy or desert sands, or the foundations of modern cities built atop ancient settlements whose existence is suspected, but whose full extent and significance remain unknown, because excavation would require demolishing structures that are currently in use and disrupting the lives of present-day inhabitants who have their own claims on the landscape and their own needs that may conflict with the archaeological imperative to dig up the past and examine what lies beneath. The development of new technologies like LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create detailed topographical maps that can penetrate vegetation and reveal subtle variations in ground elevation that indicate buried structures, has revolutionized archaeology in recent years, leading to the discovery of entire cities that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries, their presence suspected from surface features, but their true scale and complexity only becoming apparent when modern technology could strip away the concealing vegetation and reveal the underlying patterns of walls and roads and buildings that had been slowly disappearing beneath the encroaching forest. And we can only imagine what other discoveries are waiting to be made as these technologies become more sophisticated and more widely applied. Because every major archaeological discovery of the past century has raised new questions and complicated our understanding of human history, rather than simplifying it, suggesting that the more we learn about our past, the more we realize how little we actually know, and how many chapters of the human story remain unwritten, because the evidence has been lost or destroyed, or simply has not yet been found. And if that pattern continues, and there is no reason to think it will not, then we are only at the beginning of a long process of revising and expanding our understanding of who we are and where we came from. A process that will require not just new technologies and new discoveries, but also new ways of thinking about human potential and human achievement that do not rely on the comfortable assumption that progress is linear and that civilization emerges once in one place and then spreads outward too. Enlighten the supposedly primitive peoples waiting in darkness for the light of culture to reach them and transform their existence. Because the evidence increasingly suggests that human brilliance is not a rare mutation that appeared in one population and then diffused to others, but rather a fundamental capacity that expresses itself repeatedly across time and space. And if we want to understand the full implications of that realization, we need to confront some uncomfortable questions about what happened to these ancient civilizations. What knowledge was lost when they collapsed or were abandoned, and whether we are in danger of repeating their mistakes in our own blind rush toward a future that may hold either transcendence or catastrophe, depending on choices we make today that will echo across the centuries, just as the choices made by the builders of Göbekli Tepe continue to echo across the 11,600 years that separate their time from ours. The fundamental problem with understanding ancient civilizations, like the ones that built Göbekli Tepe and established the earliest settlements at Jericho and developed sophisticated agricultural systems at Mehrgarh, is that we have placed an arbitrary and profoundly misleading dividing line through human history, labeling everything before the invention of writing as prehistory, as if the absence of written records somehow means that nothing of importance happened, or that the people living in those times were less fully human or less capable of profound thought and accumulated wisdom than those who came after, when, in reality, the invention of writing was simply one technological innovation among many, no more fundamental to human consciousness or cultural sophistication than the invention of the wheel or the domestication of fire. And yet, we have allowed this single technological achievement to define our entire understanding of when real history begins, creating a situation where thousands of years of human experience and achievement and accumulated knowledge are essentially dismissed or minimized or treated as a kind of prologue to the main story, when in fact, those millennia before writing represent the vast majority of human existence and include some of our species' most significant achievements, including the development of language itself, the domestication of plants and animals, the invention of agriculture, the creation of permanent settlements, and the emergence of the kind of complex social structures that made civilization possible in the first place, all of which happened during this supposedly preliminary period that we have relegated to the margins of historical consciousness, simply because the people living through these revolutionary changes did not have the technology to record their experiences in written form that could survive across the millennia to tell us directly what they were thinking and feeling and believing about the world they inhabited and the changes they were witnessing and participating in. The absence of written records does not mean the absence of knowledge, a fact that should be obvious but somehow continues to elude many people, who seem to believe that information only truly exists when it is encoded in permanent form, whether on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, or printed pages, or digital files stored on servers somewhere. But human beings possessed sophisticated bodies of knowledge long before they developed writing systems to record that knowledge. And they transmitted this information across generations through oral traditions and practical demonstrations. And the kind of embodied learning that happens when an apprentice works alongside a master craftsperson, or a child accompanies a parent on hunting expeditions or gathering trips, absorbing not just facts, but entire ways of understanding and interacting with the world that are too complex and too subtle to be fully captured in written form, even when writing is available. Which is why even today, in our supposedly advanced, literate society, we still rely heavily on oral transmission and hands-on training for many of the most important skills and much of the most valuable knowledge. Because some things simply cannot be adequately communicated through text alone, but require direct experience and personal guidance, and the kind of tacit knowledge that lives in bodies and practices rather than in books and databases. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintained accurate geographical and ecological information across more than 10,000 years through songlines, which are essentially musical maps that encode information about water sources and food availability and sacred sites and the routes one needs to follow to navigate across vast stretches of desert or forest. And these songlines are not simple mnemonic devices, but rather complex knowledge systems that contain astronomical information and ecological observations and historical narratives and spiritual teachings, all woven together in intricate patterns that can be transmitted from generation to generation with remarkable fidelity, demonstrating that oral cultures are capable of preserving detailed and accurate information across timescales that rival or even exceed what literate cultures have achieved with their written records, which have the advantage of permanence, but also the significant disadvantage of being static and unable to adapt or evolve in response to changing circumstances, the way oral traditions can, incorporating new information and updating old understandings while maintaining the core knowledge that allows communities to survive and thrive across centuries and millennia of environmental and social change. Similarly, Native American oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of geological events that happened thousands of years ago, including the formation of Crater Lake in Oregon through the collapse of Mount Mazama approximately 7,700 years ago, an event that is described in the traditional stories of the Klamath people, with enough detail and accuracy that geologists have been able to correlate the oral accounts with their scientific understanding of what happened. And there are numerous other examples of indigenous oral traditions preserving accurate information about landscape changes and catastrophic events that occurred in the deep past, long before writing was available to record such occurrences, which should make us reconsider our assumptions about the reliability and sophistication of oral transmission, and recognize that the lack of written records from ancient civilizations does not mean we know nothing about them, or that they knew nothing worth preserving, but rather means that we have lost access to their knowledge because the systems they used to store and transmit that knowledge did not survive in forms that we can easily decode or interpret, leaving us to reconstruct their understanding from fragmentary physical evidence and the faint echoes that may have survived in later traditions and practices that descended from those earlier cultures, often in forms so transformed and adapted to new circumstances that the original content is barely recognizable beneath the accumulated layers of reinterpretation and cultural evolution. The practical skills possessed by ancient peoples represent another category of knowledge that we have largely lost, because such knowledge lives in practices and techniques that must be demonstrated and learned through hands-on experience, rather than being easily transmitted through written descriptions. And the archaeological evidence makes clear that ancient builders and craftspeople possessed sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques that we have struggled to replicate, even with our modern scientific knowledge and technological capabilities, suggesting that there were entire bodies of practical knowledge that were developed through centuries of experimentation, refinement, and then lost when the civilizations that possessed them collapsed or transformed or simply stopped practicing those particular techniques because circumstances changed or priorities shifted, or the knowledge failed to be transmitted to the next generation because the master craftspeople died before they could fully train their apprentices, or because social disruptions broke the chains of transmission that had kept these traditions alive for countless generations. Roman concrete, for instance, is demonstrably superior to most modern concrete formulations in terms of durability and longevity, remaining intact and functional after 2,000 years, while modern concrete structures begin to deteriorate after a few decades. And although researchers have made progress in understanding the composition and techniques used by Roman builders, we still cannot fully replicate their achievements, suggesting that there were subtle aspects of their methodology that were never written down, but rather existed as embodied knowledge possessed by the builders themselves, knowledge that was lost when the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the economic and social systems that supported large-scale construction projects disintegrated, leaving later generations to look at crumbling aqueducts and standing amphitheatres and wonder how their ancestors had managed to create structures of such permanence and quality using what appeared to be relatively simple materials and techniques. Damascus steel represents another example of lost technological knowledge, a material prized throughout the ancient and medieval world for its combination of strength and flexibility, and its distinctive watered appearance, created by the complex crystalline structure of the metal, produced through forging techniques that involved combining different types of steel and working them at specific temperatures with specific hammering patterns that created the characteristic bands and patterns that made Damascus blades not just functional tools and weapons, but also objects of considerable aesthetic beauty. And although modern metallurgists have analysed surviving examples of Damascus steel and have developed various theories about how it was produced, and have even managed to create materials with similar properties using modern technology, we still do not fully understand all the details of the original process. And there is general agreement that the authentic Damascus steel produced in South Asia and the Middle East before the techniques were lost in the 18th century represented a level of metallurgical sophistication that was not matched or exceeded until the development of modern steel alloys in the industrial age. Which means that for more than a century there was a gap in human capability, where we had forgotten how to make something our ancestors considered routine, only gradually recovering and eventually surpassing their achievement through entirely different methods based on scientific understanding of metallurgy that would have been completely foreign to the original Damascus steelmakers who worked through empirical experimentation and accumulated practical knowledge rather than through theoretical understanding of molecular structures and phase transitions. Even in architecture and acoustics, there are examples of ancient achievements that continue to puzzle modern experts, such as the acoustic properties of ancient Greek theatres, where a whisper on the stage can be heard clearly in the back rows, despite the absence of any electronic amplification, an effect that results from the precise geometric arrangement of the seating and the reflective properties of the materials used, and probably also from subtle features of the construction that are not immediately obvious to contemporary observers, but which were clearly understood by the architects who designed these spaces. And while modern acoustic engineers can measure and analyze these properties, and can design concert halls and auditoriums with excellent sound quality using contemporary materials and computer modeling, there is something remarkable and slightly humbling about the fact that ancient builders, working without the benefit of scientific acoustics or computer simulations, or any of the tools we consider essential for solving such problems, were nevertheless able to create spaces with acoustic properties that remain impressive by modern standards, suggesting that they possessed intuitive understanding of sound propagation and architectural geometry that was developed through observation and experimentation and practical experience, rather than through formal theoretical frameworks. And this kind of embodied practical knowledge is precisely what is most vulnerable to being lost during periods of social disruption or cultural transformation, because it exists in the minds and hands of practitioners, rather than in written treatises or instruction manuals that can be preserved and consulted by later generations trying to recover lost arts and technologies. The vulnerability of human knowledge to catastrophic loss becomes especially concerning when we consider the evidence for dramatic climate events and natural disasters that punctuate the archaeological record, suggesting that ancient civilizations were repeatedly subjected to environmental stresses that would have tested their resilience and possibly exceeded their capacity to adapt, leading to collapses that destroyed not just physical infrastructure, but also the accumulated knowledge and cultural practices that had taken centuries to develop. Because when a civilization collapses quickly and thoroughly enough, the chain of transmission between generations can be broken, leaving survivors who possess fragments of the old knowledge but lack the complete understanding or the social structures or the resource base necessary to maintain the full complexity of what came before, forcing them to simplify and adapt and focus on immediate survival at the expense of preserving specialized knowledge and sophisticated practices that may have seemed less urgent than finding food and shelter and safety in the aftermath of whatever catastrophe had destroyed their previous way of life. The Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate cooling that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for about 1,300 years, would have had devastating effects on human populations adapted to the warmer conditions that had preceded it, potentially destroying food sources and forcing migrations, and creating competition for diminishing resources that could have led to warfare and social collapse. And while we cannot know exactly how many civilizations or cultural traditions were lost during this period, it seems reasonable to assume that the archaeological record is missing considerable information about human achievements during the late Paleolithic, simply because the communities that created those achievements were disrupted or destroyed by environmental changes they could not predict or control, or adequately respond to given the technologies and social structures available to them at the time. Regional catastrophes would have been even more common than global climate events, with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and floods and droughts affecting specific areas, and potentially destroying thriving communities that had developed sophisticated knowledge and technologies adapted to their particular environments. And each such disaster would have resulted in the loss of some portion of human knowledge and capability. Sometimes temporarily, if survivors managed to rebuild and reconstitute their cultural practices, but sometimes permanently, if the disruption was severe enough to break the chains of transmission, or if circumstances in the aftermath of the disaster were different enough that the old knowledge no longer seemed relevant or applicable to the new situation facing the survivors, creating a kind of ratchet effect where human knowledge and cultural sophistication could increase during stable periods, but then decline sharply during catastrophic disruptions, with the overall trajectory of human civilization representing not smooth, linear progress, but rather a jagged path, with periodic setbacks and recoveries and occasional losses that were never fully made good. Because the specific combination of circumstances and accumulated knowledge that had produced some particular achievement was never recreated in quite the same way, leaving later civilizations to reinvent solutions to problems that had already been solved by their predecessors, but whose solutions had been lost in the fog of prehistory, along with so much else that we can only glimpse in fragmentary form through the archaeological record. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of this recognition that knowledge can be lost and has been lost repeatedly throughout human history is the realization that civilization itself is far more fragile than we typically assume, that the complex web of knowledge and infrastructure and social practices that sustains our current way of life is vulnerable to disruptions that could break critical links and force future generations to rediscover or reinvent capabilities that we take for granted. And while we like to think that our written records and our digital storage systems and our global communication networks provide redundancy and protection against catastrophic loss of knowledge, we should remember that every previous civilization probably felt similarly confident about its own systems for preserving and transmitting important information. And yet, knowledge was lost anyway. Sometimes slowly, through neglect and changing priorities, and the simple fact that maintaining complex knowledge systems requires continuous effort and resources that may not always be available. And sometimes, suddenly, through catastrophes that destroyed not just physical infrastructure, but also the communities of practitioners who embodied crucial knowledge that existed nowhere else in forms that could be easily recovered or reconstructed. The myths and legends preserved in various cultural traditions often contain references to advanced ancestors, or lost golden ages, or catastrophic floods and destructions that reset human civilization. And while we have tended to dismiss these stories as pure fantasy, or perhaps as garbled memories of minor local events, magnified through repeated retelling into cosmic catastrophes, the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that we should take these traditions more seriously as potential repositories of historical information about real events that affected real human populations, even if the details have been transformed and mythologized through countless retellings and reinterpretations across the generations that separate us from the original occurrences. Because if multiple cultures, separated by geography and time, all preserve similar stories of catastrophic destruction and societal collapse and knowledge lost, perhaps what we are seeing is not independent invention of similar myths, but rather parallel preservation of memories of actual historical events that were dramatic enough and traumatic enough to leave permanent marks on human cultural consciousness, surviving in story form, long after all other evidence of what actually happened had been erased by time and the endless transformations of landscape and culture that make the deep past so difficult to access and so easy to dismiss as irrelevant to our contemporary concerns, when in fact, those lost civilizations and forgotten catastrophes may have more to teach us about our own vulnerability and our own potential for both achievement and destruction than we are comfortable acknowledging, especially now when we face environmental and social challenges that echo in disturbing ways the crises that may have brought down earlier. Civilizations whose ruins we study with a combination of fascination and unease, wondering whether we are looking at the remains of our distant ancestors or at a preview of our own possible future if we fail to learn from their example, or if we prove unable to navigate the increasingly obvious dangers that threaten to transform our own sophisticated civilization into another layer of archaeological sediment, waiting to be discovered by whatever comes after us. Assuming anything does come after us, and assuming our own ruins preserve enough information for future archaeologists to reconstruct what we achieved and what we lost, and why we failed to maintain the knowledge and the practices that had sustained us through earlier challenges, but proved inadequate when confronted with problems that exceeded our capacity to adapt or our willingness to change, or simply our ability to coordinate collective action at the scale necessary to address existential threats that recognized no boundaries and respected no sovereignty, and demanded responses that our fragmented political systems and our competing interests and our fundamentally short-term thinking made effectively impossible to implement before the window of opportunity closed, and the worst-case scenarios we had dismissed as alarmist pessimism became the new reality within which our survivors would have to improvise solutions, using whatever fragments of knowledge and infrastructure remained after the collapse of the systems that had made our previous way of life possible, forcing them to confront directly the question that should haunt anyone who studies the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. What happens next? The narrative we have been constructing throughout human history about our own centrality and our own uniqueness, and our own position as the inevitable culmination of a long evolutionary and cultural process that led inexorably from primitive beginnings to our current state of technological sophistication, needs to be fundamentally reconsidered and probably discarded entirely in favor of something more honest and more humble, and ultimately more useful as we confront challenges that may determine whether our particular iteration of human civilization survives the next few centuries or joins the long list of societies that rose to impressive heights, only to collapse back into fragments that future archaeologists might someday piece together while wondering what went wrong and whether we saw it coming, and why we proved unable or unwilling to change course before it was too late to avoid catastrophe. The discovery at Göbekli Tepe and the recognition of similar sites scattered across the ancient world forces us to acknowledge that civilization did not begin once in one favored location, blessed by geography and populated by uniquely gifted people, who then spread their superior culture to less advanced populations, waiting passively for enlightenment, but rather that the capacity for civilization is something fundamental to human nature, something that has emerged repeatedly across time and space, whenever conditions allowed. Which means that we are not special in the way we have always assumed. Not the first people to achieve sophistication or complexity, or monumental architecture, or sophisticated social organization, but merely the latest in a long series of human societies that have reached similar levels of achievement. And while this realization might seem deflating to those who prefer to think of themselves as standing at the apex of human progress, it is actually far more interesting and far more empowering than the old narrative ever was. Because it suggests that human creativity and adaptability and aspiration are not rare accidents, but reliable features of our species that will continue to manifest themselves as long as humans exist and as long as circumstances permit. The kind of surplus and stability and social cooperation that allows civilizations to develop and flourish. The humility lesson embedded in these ancient ruins is profound and necessary, especially for a culture like ours that has grown accustomed to thinking of itself as the pinnacle of human achievement and the obvious endpoint toward which all previous history was inevitably moving. Because when you stand among those massive carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe, or walk the ancient streets of Jericho, or examine the sophisticated metallurgy of Bronze Age Southeast Asia, or contemplate the scale and precision of construction projects undertaken by people who supposedly lacked all the technological advantages we consider essential for such undertakings, you cannot help but confront the uncomfortable reality that our ancestors were every bit as intelligent and creative and capable as we are, and that the main advantages we possess over them are purely circumstantial, rather than representing any fundamental superiority of mind or spirit or human potential. Which means that all our contemporary achievements, impressive as they may be in certain respects, are built on foundations laid by countless previous generations who solved similar problems with different tools and left behind monuments and artifacts and accumulated knowledge that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate after centuries of dismissing or minimizing or simply ignoring evidence that did not fit comfortably into our preferred narratives about linear progress and the triumph of Western civilization over the supposedly backward peoples who came before or who developed in different geographical regions without the benefit of contact with the enlightened cultures that we have traditionally placed at the center of human history. Every civilization that has ever existed has probably harbored similar delusions about its own centrality and permanence, looking at its own achievements and seeing confirmation of some kind of cosmic destiny or divine favor or historical inevitability that set it apart from all previous societies. And we can imagine the priests and architects and rulers of ancient societies standing before their own impressive monuments and feeling the same pride and confidence and certainty about their own importance that we feel when we contemplate our skyscrapers and our global communication networks and our capacity to put humans on the moon and robots on Mars, never considering that their cities might someday be buried beneath accumulated sediment and their knowledge might be lost, and their entire civilization might be reduced to a puzzle that future archaeologists would struggle to decode, while developing their own narratives about progress and achievement that would probably prove as incomplete and as biased as the narratives we have constructed about those ancient peoples whose ruins we study with such fascination and such limited understanding. But alongside the humility lesson, there is also a hope lesson that may be even more important for our current moment. Because the fact that human civilizations have repeatedly collapsed, and yet humanity has continued, that knowledge has been lost and then painstakingly recovered or reinvented. That societies have been destroyed by catastrophes, only to see new societies eventually emerge from the survivors and their descendants, suggests a resilience and a fundamental persistence in human nature that is actually quite encouraging when you consider the scale of the challenges we currently face, and the real possibility that our own civilization might be heading towards some kind of collapse or transformation that will be traumatic and destructive, but not necessarily final. Not the end of the human story, but rather another chapter in the long saga of our species' complicated relationship with the natural world, and with our own capacity for both creation and destruction, both wisdom and folly, both cooperation and competition. Because the pattern that emerges from studying the archaeological record is not one of steady, linear progress, but rather one of cycles and oscillations, of rises and falls, of periods of florescence, followed by periods of collapse, followed eventually by new beginnings that may build on fragments of what came before, or may start fresh with entirely new approaches to the eternal problems of how to organize society and how to extract resources from the environment, and how to create meaning and beauty and significance in lives that are inevitably bounded by mortality and uncertainty, and the knowledge that everything we build will eventually crumble, and everything we achieve will eventually be forgotten, unless we find ways to transmit it to future generations, who may or may not value what we valued, or understand what we considered important, or even recognize that we existed at all, except as mysterious ruins that raise more questions than they answer. The revolution currently underway in archaeology, driven by new technologies like LiDAR and satellite imagery, and increasingly sophisticated methods of dating and chemical analysis and genetic sequencing, is revealing the past in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago. And every major discovery pushes back timelines and complicates narratives and forces revisions to textbooks and museum exhibits and the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from and how we got to where we are. Which means that we are living through a particularly exciting moment in human knowledge, when the foundations of our understanding are being actively reconstructed, and when anyone paying attention to developments in archaeology and related fields can watch in real time as the map of human history is being redrawn with each new excavation and each new technological breakthrough that reveals hidden structures beneath jungle canopies or desert sands, or the foundations of modern cities built atop ancient settlements whose full extent and complexity have been hidden by centuries of accumulated debris and subsequent construction. The jungles of Central America have already yielded entire Maya cities that were completely unknown until LiDAR surveys revealed their presence beneath the dense vegetation. And similar technologies are being applied in other regions with equally dramatic results, suggesting that we have only scratched the surface of what remains to be discovered about ancient civilizations and their achievements, and that the next few decades will likely bring revelations that will require further revisions to our understanding of when civilization began and where it developed, and how sophisticated ancient peoples actually were. Which means that the story told in this exploration of forgotten civilizations is not complete, but rather represents just one moment in an ongoing process of discovery and reinterpretation that will continue as long as there are researchers curious enough to look beneath the surface and willing to challenge established narratives when the evidence demands it, even when such challenges threaten comfortable assumptions or require acknowledgement that previous generations of scholars got important things wrong because they were working with incomplete information, or because they allowed their own cultural biases and assumptions to shape their interpretations in ways that distorted the evidence, or because they simply lacked the tools and technologies necessary to see what was actually there, rather than what they expected to find. The uncomfortable questions raised by recognition of multiple independent origins of civilization, and the clear evidence that sophisticated societies existed far earlier than conventional timelines allowed, cannot be easily dismissed or explained away, because they go to the heart of how we understand human nature and human potential, and the factors that enable or constrain cultural development. And they force us to confront the possibility that we understand far less about our own past than we thought we did, which in turn raises questions about how much we really understand about our present and our likely future. Because if we could be so wrong about something as fundamental as when and where and how civilization began, what other important things might we be wrong about? What other assumptions might we be making that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of condescension and puzzlement that we sometimes direct toward earlier scholars who were convinced of things that we now know to be false or oversimplified or based on incomplete evidence? The question of how many times human civilization has collapsed and rebooted becomes particularly pressing when we consider the environmental and social challenges currently facing our own society. Because the archaeological record suggests that collapse is not some rare aberration that only happens to societies that make particularly egregious mistakes or that are uniquely vulnerable due to geographical or climatic factors, but rather is a recurring pattern that has affected sophisticated and seemingly stable civilizations throughout history, often with little warning and sometimes with shocking rapidity, transforming thriving societies into archaeological puzzles within the span of a few generations, leaving survivors to pick up whatever pieces they could salvage and try to rebuild something from the ruins, usually with considerably less sophistication and considerably fewer resources than their ancestors had enjoyed before whatever catastrophe or cascade of catastrophes brought down the previous order and forced a painful process of adaptation and simplification and starting over. The question of whether we are learning from the past or simply repeating its mistakes becomes more urgent with each passing year as evidence accumulates that our current trajectory is unsustainable and that the systems we have built to support our way of life are showing signs of strain that echo in disturbing ways the kinds of stresses that preceded collapses of earlier civilizations. Because while the specific details differ, and while we have technologies and knowledge that ancient peoples lacked, the fundamental dynamics of civilizational collapse seem to be relatively consistent across time and culture, involving some combination of environmental degradation, resource depletion, social inequality, political dysfunction, and loss of faith in existing institutions and narratives that hold societies together and give them coherence and direction. And when you look at our current situation with any degree of honesty, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that we are exhibiting several, if not all, of these warning signs. Which does not necessarily mean that collapse is inevitable or imminent, but does suggest that we should be taking the possibility considerably more seriously than we typically do in our public discourse and our political decision-making. And our individual choices about how to live and what to prioritize, and how much we should be willing to sacrifice in the present to avoid catastrophic outcomes in the future. The parallels between our situation and the situations that faced ancient civilizations before their collapse are imperfect, as all historical analogies must be, but they are also suggestive enough that dismissing them as irrelevant, or assuming that we are somehow exempt from the patterns that have repeated throughout human history, seems dangerously complacent. The kind of attitude that probably characterized the final generations of other civilizations that assumed their own permanence right up until the moment when it became obvious that everything was falling apart, and that the assumptions they had built their lives around were being revealed as illusory, leaving them scrambling to adapt to new realities that their previous experience had not prepared them for, and that their social and political structures were not designed to handle. And yet, despite all these warnings and all the evidence of fragility and all the uncomfortable parallels between past collapses and present vulnerabilities, there remains something fundamentally hopeful about the story that emerges from studying these ancient sites and recognizing the pattern of repeated civilizational emergence. Because it suggests that human beings possess a kind of irrepressible creativity and adaptability that persists even through catastrophic disruptions. That we keep trying to build something that lasts, that we continue to reach for beauty and meaning and significance, even when circumstances are difficult and the future is uncertain, and there are no guarantees that our efforts will be remembered or appreciated by anyone, except perhaps some future archaeologist who might stumble upon our ruins and wonder who we were and what we were trying to achieve, and why we failed or succeeded in ways that leave only fragmentary evidence for interpretation. The builders of Göbekli Tepe probably did not imagine that their monument would still be standing 11,600 years later, still capable of inspiring awe and wonder in people who would have been utterly alien to them in terms of technology and culture and worldview. And yet, their achievement has outlasted whatever civilization created it and whatever purposes it originally served, becoming something different and perhaps even more significant as a testament to human capability and human aspiration that transcends the specific context of its creation and speaks to fundamental aspects of what it means to be human, what it means to dream of permanence in a world of flux, what it means to invest enormous effort into creating something that may or may not endure, but that represents the best of what we are capable of achieving when we work together toward common goals that extend beyond mere survival and immediate gratification. The image we began with, that archaeologists, trowel striking stone and beginning the process of revelation that would ultimately require us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization, becomes finally a metaphor for the ongoing work of understanding ourselves and our place in the long sweep of human history. Because every new discovery is like another strike of the trowel, revealing a little more of what was hidden, complicating the picture, raising new questions, forcing us to revise and expand, and sometimes completely abandon our previous understanding, in favor of something more accurate and more honest, and ultimately more useful, as we navigate our own uncertain future. And what these ancient ruins teach us, more than any specific fact about dates or technologies or social structures, is that human history is longer and stranger and more complex than we ever imagined. That we stand not at the apex of a pyramid, but at one point along a jagged line that extends backward into deep time and forward into an unknown future, that we are connected to our ancient ancestors, not just through biological descent, but through shared capacities for both brilliance and failure, both creation and destruction, both wisdom and folly, and that the choices we make in our own historical moment will determine whether we join the list of civilizations that collapsed and disappeared, or whether we manage to navigate the challenges ahead and build something that endures. Not necessarily forever, because nothing lasts forever, but long enough to pass on to our descendants some portion of what we have learned and achieved, adding our own chapter to the long story of human civilization that began long before we thought it did, and will continue in forms we cannot predict for as long as there are humans to carry it forward, stubbornly and brilliantly, trying to build something that matters, even in the face of entropy and uncertainty, and the knowledge that everything we create will eventually return to dust. Because that persistence in the face of inevitable mortality and inevitable loss is perhaps the most fundamentally human characteristic of all, and it is what connects us across the millennia to those anonymous builders who moved massive stones and carved intricate patterns and organized complex projects, and then buried their greatest achievement and walked away into history, leaving behind only questions and possibilities, and the humbling reminder that we are not the first people to reach for greatness, and we will not be the last. Assuming we can find ways to preserve and transmit enough knowledge and enough wisdom to give future generations a fighting chance to learn from our successes and our failures, and to build their own version of civilization on whatever fragments they inherit from us, which is all any generation can really do. Take what came before, add something new, and pass it forward with the hope that it will mean something to someone who comes after, even if we cannot know who they will be or what challenges they will face, or whether they will remember us at all, except as mysterious ruins that tell an incomplete story about people who lived and dreamed and built and eventually disappeared, leaving only stones and questions and the eternal mystery of what it means to be human in a universe that does not promise permanence to anything we create, but does not prevent us from trying anyway.